The desert had always moved in silence. Its dunes shifted like thoughts in a sleeping mind, slow, patient, endless. To most men it was emptiness. To him it was home. The man's name was Nabir ibn Khalid, son of a spice merchant and a dreamer's mother. He lived in the city of Ubar, the place travelers called the Atlantis of the sands, a hub of frankincense trade, a glimmering mirage made of limestone towers and perfumed markets. From the east came caravans carrying silk and stories. From the west, camels loaded with salt and gold. Ubar thrived at the edge of the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, so vast that even the wind lost its direction there. Nabir was 35 that year. He had a wife, Samira, whose laughter once filled their small courtyard like spring water fills a well. She tended jasmine vines that climbed the walls, their scent clinging to his robes when he returned from trade routes. Together they had a little boy, Yusuf, barely 7, who believed the dunes were sleeping beasts and that his father could command them with a whisper. Nabir never corrected him. He liked that kind of faith. For generations, the people of Ubar believed their city was favored, built upon veins of frankincense that kept them rich and sweet-smelling. They said the desert loved them, but lately the desert had changed its voice. It began with the ground. Merchants complained that the wells were filling with silt, that water tasted of stone. Shepherds swore their herds refused to drink. Then came the storms, not the ordinary passing veils of sand, but walls of wind that rolled in from the horizon like the wrath of something ancient. They struck without pattern, devouring tents, silencing songs. When they cleared, dunes had moved, whole streets swallowed, towers half buried, doors sealed by sand. Nabir had seen cities die on the trade routes, oasis towns abandoned after wells dried, tribes vanished after war. But this felt different. The air itself seemed heavy with waiting. Nights grew colder. The moon, once sharp and clean, now rose behind a veil of dust. He kept a journal, though he was not a scholar. "The desert listens," he wrote. "When it hears arrogance, it answers." One evening he climbed to the roof to mend a water jar cracked by the sun. From there, Ubar looked eternal, torches flickering in the wind, towers glowing like the ribs of a great beast. But on the far edge of the city, near the southern gate, the sands looked wrong, rippled, restless, alive. He watched them tremble, not with wind, but with something beneath. That night Samira woke him. "Do you hear it?" she whispered. At first he thought it was thunder. Then he realized it came from underground. A deep, soft groaning, as if the desert were breathing. In the morning, the market murmured of sinkholes. A trader's stable had collapsed into dust, camels vanishing as if pulled by invisible hands. The governor sent guards to investigate, but by the time they arrived, the hole had already filled itself with drifting sand. Nothing remained. Still, life went on. Frankincense burned in brass bowls. The air shimmered with heat. Wealth was louder than fear. Nabir wanted to believe it was only nature. He told Samira the city stood on limestone caverns, fragile, yes, but ancient, unlikely to yield all at once. "The desert shifts," he said. "It is what it does." But his voice betrayed him. She smiled anyway, the way women do when they know the truth but choose kindness instead. Weeks later, a caravan arrived from the east, its men trembling, clothes ripped by sandstorms. They carried news. Towns along the route to Shisur were gone, wells swallowed, entire camps erased. "The desert walks," one said. "It moves in the night." The governor of Ubar laughed. "Let it walk. It cannot cross our walls." He ordered new trade routes, richer incense taxes, a celebration for the gods. On the day of the feast, he stood on the balcony of his palace and poured libations into the dust. thanking the desert for obedience. Nabir stood among the crowd, watching the wine sink without trace. The ground seemed to drink too quickly. That evening the wind changed direction. It blew inward from every side, spiraling toward the city's heart. Dust rose in columns. Camels bellowed. Children cried out for their mothers as lanterns flickered and died. Then came the silence, so deep it pressed against his ears. Samira gripped his arm. "Where's Yusuf?" He turned, and the boy was gone. He ran through alleys choked with sand. The air tasted of stone and resin. From the roof lines he saw the dunes collapsing inward, folding like fabric. Towers leaned, their foundations melting into softness. The governor's palace sank halfway in an hour. People screamed, but the sound was muffled as if the world were swallowing its own voice. He found Yusuf's small sandal near the spice market. Beside it, the ground had opened into a dark throat of sand. He shouted until his voice tore. Then the wind answered with a single hollow moan. Samira tried to pull him back, but the edge gave way. They both tumbled, half buried, coughing, clawing. When he dragged himself free, she was no longer beside him. Only her scarf, caught on a buried beam, fluttered once before the sand covered it. He stood there until dawn, alone, while the city sank inch by inch. Towers vanished like fading torches. By sunrise, Ubar was gone. 30,000 souls erased, their homes leveled into an ocean of dunes. Nabir did not die that day. He wandered westward, blind with dust and grief, following the faint hum of wind that still carried voices. He did not know how far he walked before the dunes grew calm. When he finally collapsed beside a dry wadi, he was no longer sure whether the city had truly existed at all. Years later, travelers met a lone man near the empty quarter's edge, a man who claimed the sand could speak. They said he carried a small vial of frankincense around his neck and never slept under a roof. When asked where he came from, he only pointed east, toward the endless desert, and whispered, "It's still there." Beneath, they thought him mad. But some nights, when the wind rose from that direction, they swore they could hear bells, faint, buried, ringing under the dunes. The desert had turned him into silence. For months after Ubar's disappearance, Nabir spoke to no one. He drifted between caravans, sometimes walking beside traders who offered him dates and water, sometimes disappearing again before they could ask his name. The sun browned his skin, cracked his lips, burned the color from his robes until he looked like part of the landscape itself. At night he listened. He had learned the difference between wind that whistled through dunes and the wind that whispered around something buried. The latter was softer, circular, as if traveling through hollows. Beneath the dunes, he believed, the breath of the lost city still moved. One dusk he reached a ridge above a long flat plain. The horizon glowed red. He thought of fire, but there was none. Only the reflection of the sun off sand polished smooth by storms. It shimmered like water. He remembered how Yusuf used to chase mirages, laughing, sure he could catch them in a jar. The memory bent him double. Grief arrived not with tears now, but with a sudden emptiness so large it stole the strength from his knees. A passing nomad tribe found him there. They gave him a cloak, bread, and shelter for the night. When their elder asked where he was going, Nabir answered simply, "Back." The old man frowned. "Back to what?" "The place that forgot us," Nabir said. When he returned months later, there was no sign of Ubar, not even rubble, only dunes rising like frozen waves. Yet he could feel the outline beneath, the memory of streets that once smelled of frankincense and grain. He began to walk the invisible roads. Here was the market, here the mosque. Here, where the wind hissed through a crack, his own courtyard must have been. He knelt and pressed his palm into the sand. "Samira," he whispered. The dune shifted slightly, sighing. It felt like breath. He built a small tent at the edge of what he believed was the old northern gate. He planted no crops, kept no fire. Each evening he lit a single stick of incense and watched its smoke climb into the wind until it vanished. He said the desert liked to be reminded of its mistakes. Word of the lone hermit spread among traders. Some said he guarded the city's treasure, others that he was cursed. A few scholars came, hoping to record his story. He told them everything. The tremors, the night the wind closed in, the silence after. Most smiled politely and left, calling him a poet. One, a young scribe from Oman, stayed. The scribe's name was Harith. He listened for days, writing by the light of a flickering lamp. When he finished, he asked, "If all is buried, why do you stay?" Nabir answered, "Because someone must remember where they stood." Years passed. The dunes shifted again. One morning, Nabir woke to find his tent half buried. The incense bowl was gone, swallowed overnight. He laughed quietly. "It still eats," he said. He began carving small markers from driftwood brought by caravans. Not tombstones exactly, but signs. A circle for the market, a triangle for the palace, a single line for the well. He placed them where memory told him they belonged. When wind erased them, he carved more. "If we name the sand," he told Harith, "we keep it human." On a rare clear night, when the moon laid a silver path across the dunes, he dreamed. He saw lights under the surface, faint, bluish, trembling like lanterns seen through water. He followed them, walking barefoot across the cool sand, until he reached a place where the ground seemed hollow. He knelt, listening. He could swear he heard voices, hundreds of them, whispering as though in prayer. He whispered back. Morning brought no lights, only footprints circling his tent, his own, or perhaps wind-shaped. He never decided. As years deepened into decades, Nabir grew slower but calmer. The storm season came and went. Each time he thought it might be the one to cover him completely, to make him part of what he guarded. He didn't fear it. He had stopped fearing the desert the day it took everything. Travelers occasionally offered to take him away. He always declined. "A city is not a place," he said once. "It is the echo it leaves in the people who remember." Harith, now an old man himself, returned once more with other scholars. They dug shallow pits, careful and respectful, and found pottery shards, blackened incense burners, pieces of columns crusted with salt. Nothing gruesome, only hints. Enough to prove that something immense had been there. The desert had not lied. It had only hidden. When they told Nabir the news, he smiled faintly. "So it breathes again," he said. That night, he lit one final stick of incense, watched the smoke rise straight into the still air, and lay down beside the dune. In the morning his tent was empty, folded neatly, his footprints trailing east. No one ever found him. Centuries later, archaeologists would speak of the lost city with scientific wonder. Its limestone caves, the collapse caused by sinkholes, the mirage that lured travelers. Yet among Bedouins there would remain another version. The tale of a man who stayed behind, tending invisible streets, whispering to the sand so that the city would not be lonely. They said on certain nights, when the wind pauses and the desert holds its breath, you can smell faint frankincense in the air, as if someone still lights a single stick for the ones the desert swallowed whole. The dunes did not remember faces, yet they remembered footsteps. Long after Nabir's footprints vanished, the sand still shifted differently where he had walked, as if his weight had taught it a slower rhythm. Centuries turned like pages in a forgotten book. Empires rose along the coasts. Trade routes moved north, and Ubar became a rumor carried in caravan songs. In markets from Aden to Damascus, storytellers spoke of a city that shone brighter than any star, and then fell silent overnight. They never agreed on its name. Some said Iram, others Wabar or Ubar, but they always agreed on one thing. The desert had taken it because of pride. And somewhere, it was whispered, a man had watched it happen and refused to leave. That man became legend too. Travelers told of a lone wanderer who walked before sandstorms, warning camps to move. He was neither young nor old, his eyes full of distant firelight. Sometimes he vanished mid-sentence, leaving only a trace of spice in the air. He was called the Keeper. 1,000 years after Ubar's fall, a small caravan of explorers crossed the same quarter of the Rub al-Khali. Their leader, Layth al-Rahmani, was a scholar from Basra, part astronomer, part skeptic. He had read the accounts of Harith, the ancient scribe who had recorded Nabir's words. The parchment was fragile, the ink faded, but one phrase remained clear. "It still breathes beneath." That line haunted him. Layth was no fool. He sought not ghosts, but geology, the collapsed limestone caverns that could explain the myth. Yet when the wind rose, carrying a scent faintly sweet and smoky, even he fell silent. "Frankincense," murmured one of his guides. "There's none for 100 miles." They camped near a ridge shaped like a broken crescent. In the night the ground trembled lightly, not with danger but with memory. Layth dreamed of a city half made of light, half of dust, and of a man walking through it holding a bowl of smoke. When he woke, the scent still lingered. At dawn they began to dig where the sand seemed thinner. Within days they struck stone, smooth blocks, carved edges. Beneath that, shards of pottery, a piece of a column crusted in salt. The men worked in silence, as though unearthing a heartbeat. Each discovery brought both joy and unease. The more they found, the more they felt watched. One evening, while brushing sand from a cracked amphora, Layth uncovered a small object no larger than his thumb, a vial sealed with resin. Inside was hardened resin of frankincense, pale gold, preserved by dryness. Around its neck, the faint remains of a cord. He turned it in his hand, feeling the weight of centuries. "It belonged to someone," he whispered. His guide nodded. "Perhaps to him," he said, though neither spoke the name. That night, wind poured through the camp like breath. Tents flapped, ropes sang, but no storm followed. The air felt watchful. Layth set the vial beside the fire. The resin caught a spark and smoked for a moment before dying. The scent filled the camp, sweet, ancient, almost human. Every man fell quiet, listening. For a heartbeat, they all thought they heard voices under the sand, distant, rhythmic, murmuring as if in prayer. Then the wind changed and it was gone. They filled the pit again, marking the spot with a ring of stones. "The desert keeps what it loves," Layth said. They took nothing, not even the vial, leaving it where it had lain for a millennium. When they returned north, people asked what they had found. Layth only smiled. "A reminder," he said, "that the world forgets slower than we think." In later years, as modern machines mapped the dunes and satellites drew images from above, they confirmed what Layth and his men had felt. Beneath the sands lay the foundations of a lost city. Its walls collapsed into hollows, its streets traced faintly like veins under skin. They named it Ubar again, reviving the word from legend. But among the desert tribes they still called it by another name, Nabir's City. Those who passed the region at night sometimes saw a thin spiral of smoke rising where no camp existed. They said it was the Keeper, still lighting incense for the 30,000 souls. The wind never touched that smoke. It rose straight into the dark, as though the desert itself were holding its breath to let it pass. The year was different, the machines louder, yet the dunes still moved with the same patient rhythm. Helicopters thudded across the empty quarter now, and trucks carried drills instead of camels. What had once taken a lifetime of walking could be crossed in days. But the desert kept its secrets until it chose to speak. A research convoy from Muscat moved across the Golden Plain one morning in late winter. Among the team was Dr. Amira Hassan, an archaeologist who had grown up hearing her grandfather's tales about the city that vanished overnight. He used to end every story with the same line, "The sand forgets nothing, child." Now she was here to test that truth with satellite maps and ground-penetrating radar. From the air, the dunes looked endless, soft and innocent. But the sensors showed faint geometric shadows underneath. Rectangles, corridors, rings that could not be natural. The pilot circled twice. "You see it too?" Amira asked, and her voice trembled with awe. The others nodded. They set up camp where the signal was strongest. When the first trench was cut, the sand slid away like silk, revealing pale stone. The surface bore marks worn by time, perhaps letters, perhaps patterns. Amira brushed them with a gloved hand. "It's real," she whispered. Cameras clicked, notes were taken, but the team worked quietly. Even the hum of the generator seemed too loud. As evening fell, a dry wind rose from the east. It was not fierce, only steady, but it carried a smell that made every head turn. Sweet, resinous, unmistakable. Someone murmured, "Frankincense." They looked around for the source, but there was no fire, no smoke, only that calm perfume spreading through the dark. Amira felt the tiny hairs on her arms lift. She walked away from the lights toward a low ridge. The moon hung thin as a blade. Below her, the sand formed shallow hollows, almost like the outline of streets. She could picture it suddenly. The towers, the markets, the laughter, the voice of a man calling for his child. The vision was so clear she almost answered aloud. Back at camp, she wrote in her notebook, "The earth remembers shapes." Perhaps it remembers voices too. Days passed. The excavation revealed pillars that seemed to rise directly from the ground, each carved with faint lines. On one block, Amira found what looked like an inscription, 3 simple marks, a circle, a triangle, a line. The same symbols Nabir had once carved from driftwood. She did not know that, but she felt their intent. The need to name a place so it would not be lost. That night she dreamed she stood at the edge of a vast plain filled with lanterns under sand. A man walked among them, hooded, calm, lighting one after another. When he turned, she saw only light where his face should have been. He raised his hand as if in greeting, and she woke with the scent of incense still clinging to her. The next morning, a sandstorm approached, slow, amber, majestic. The crew secured their equipment, covering the trench with canvas. Amira watched the horizon blur. "It comes to take back what we found," one technician joked. She smiled, but something in her chest tightened. The storm arrived like a curtain falling. Visibility dropped to nothing. They stayed inside their tents, listening to the hiss of sand against fabric. Hours passed. Then suddenly silence. When they stepped outside, the dunes had changed shape entirely. The trench was gone, covered as if it had never been. Amira walked to the place where she thought the pillars had stood. Nothing but smooth sand greeted her. Yet at her feet lay a single small object, a vial of translucent resin, its cord frayed but intact. She held it gently, brushing the dust away. The resin inside glowed faintly in the dawn light. Her voice was barely a whisper. Someone kept this safe. She did not try to open it. She wrapped it in cloth and placed it at the highest point of the ridge, marking the spot with a simple cairn of stones. Then she bowed her head, not in worship but in respect. For the desert, for the city, for the man whose memory seemed to linger like fragrance. When the convoy left, the dunes already began to smooth over their tracks. Within a week, wind erased every trace of their presence. Only the cairn remained, and beside it, when the wind shifted just right, a faint scent rose again. People who travel the empty quarter today speak of that place. They say the GPS fails there, compasses spin, and for a moment you feel you're walking through a dream made of sunlight and dust. Some hear a whisper in the wind, a man's voice calling softly, a name they can't quite catch. Others simply feel watched but kindly, as if the desert itself were keeping count of who comes and who goes. No one knows what truly happened to Ubar, nor where Nabir's bones lie. But in every story told beside a fire, in every song hummed on long journeys through the dunes, there is a trace of his watchfulness. The desert may have taken the city, but through those who remember, it keeps breathing. And when night settles over the sands and the wind stills completely, a single column of smoke sometimes rises straight upward, thin and steady, into the stars. Time in the desert does not move forward. It circles. Centuries after Dr. Amira Hassan's expedition, people still pass through that same quarter of emptiness, now guided by satellites and digital maps. But maps are not memory, and what the desert hides, no signal can summon until it chooses. In a small museum on the coast of Oman, behind glass that fogged on humid mornings, lay a single exhibit labeled Fragment of the Lost City. It was a length of carved stone, its symbols worn almost smooth, a circle, a triangle, a line. Visitors often stared at it without understanding. Some walked away unimpressed. A few stayed longer, drawn by something they couldn't name, as though the stone hummed beneath the noise of the crowd. Amira had retired long ago. In her last recorded interview, her voice quivered with the same wonder she had felt in the dunes. "We looked for ruins," she said, "but what we found was memory. The sand remembers shape. The wind remembers scent. She hesitated, smiling faintly. "We remember stories." The interviewer asked whether she believed in Nabir. She answered, "Believe? The question is whether he ever stopped walking." That line outlived her. Students quoted it, journalists printed it, and soon the legend folded itself neatly into documentaries, podcasts, and songs. The man who lit incense for the vanished city became a symbol of endurance, the quiet soul who refuses to let time erase what love built. In one of those documentaries, a drone camera drifted over endless gold dunes at sunset. The narrator's voice spoke softly. "Somewhere under this sea of silence lies a city once called Ubar, a place swallowed whole by the desert. But the desert, like memory, never truly buries. It preserves." Viewers around the world watched that sequence and felt, if only for a moment, the weight of stillness. They did not know they were seeing the same ridge where Amira had placed the small cairn decades before. The stones were gone now, carried off by wind, but the camera lingered there anyway, as if guided. Later that year, a tourist caravan passed near the coordinates. Among them was a young photographer named Yara. Her grandfather had been one of the workers on Amira's crew. She had grown up hearing bedtime stories about the scent that appeared from nowhere. As she walked away from the group to capture the evening light, she felt a sudden calm settle over her. The wind paused, the air thick with warmth. Then came the faintest trace of sweetness, like resin meeting flame. She turned slowly, camera raised. Through her lens, she caught something strange, a narrow, wavering column of pale smoke rising from the sand, perfectly straight. It lasted only seconds before dissolving, leaving nothing but heat haze. She lowered the camera, heart pounding. On the image review screen there was nothing. No smoke, no distortion. Only dunes stretching into forever. That night, unable to sleep, she listened to the desert's quiet pulse. She thought she heard very far away a whisper that sounded like a name. Whether it came from memory, imagination, or the shifting sand, she didn't try to decide. She simply whispered back, "We still see you." Morning arrived crisp and silent. Her footprints from the night before had already disappeared. In the years that followed, explorers continued to debate the truth of Ubar. Some insisted it had been a center of trade destroyed by a sinkhole. Others said the city never existed at all, that it was only a mirage born from longing. But the stories refused to die. They lived in every telling, each one reshaping the city anew, each one summoning Nabir from the dunes to walk again between the towers of memory. And so, across time, the line between legend and archaeology blurred until it no longer mattered. What mattered was the feeling that somewhere, beneath the skin of the world, something ancient still waited, not for discovery, but for remembrance. when the desert winds rest at dusk, and the air holds that peculiar quiet just before darkness. Travelers sometimes stop their engines and listen. They say the silence there is different, fuller, denser, alive. Some claim they can smell faint incense. Others, more skeptical, shrug and smile. But even they admit, for one breath, it feels as if 30,000 hearts still beat beneath their feet. The city the desert swallowed whole never returned. Yet in the minds of those who hear the story, Ubar rises again and again, its towers gleaming in the last light, its markets humming, its people laughing. Somewhere among them walks a man with a bowl of smoke, glancing back once toward the edge of the dunes before fading into gold, and the desert, ever patient, keeps listening. Decades passed again, though time barely left fingerprints on the desert. The dunes shifted like sleeping giants, swallowing the tracks of every traveler who dared to cross. Satellites mapped them from above, drawing lines of data and color across screens. But the closer science looked, the more it realized how little it truly knew. In 2093, a research team from the Global Archaeological Consortium arrived with technology Nabir could never have imagined. Drones that could burrow, scanners that could read the shape of the earth beneath sand, and instruments sensitive enough to detect the faint chemical trace of ancient fires. Their leader was Dr. Elias Karam, a quiet man who had grown up listening to his grandmother's stories about the desert of the vanished. She used to whisper, "They're still down there listening." Elias never believed in ghosts, but he believed in silence, and this silence felt deliberate. The team's base was a dome of white canvas and solar panels, a strange blister of modernity in an ocean of amber. For the first week, everything went as planned. The readings were steady, the atmosphere calm. But on the 8th night, one of the instruments began to pick up something strange, rhythmic vibrations beneath the sand. Not constant, not random, almost patterned. Elias stayed up, watching the monitor flicker. The signal came and went like a heartbeat, distant and slow. When he filtered the sound through the program's audio converter, it produced a low hum, rising and falling like a breath. He laughed softly. "The desert is alive," he said, mostly to himself, but his assistant, Noor, looked uneasy. "It's not wind. The sensors are buried deep. What if it's water moving?" Elias nodded, though something in him disagreed. Maybe. They didn't know that at the same hour, miles away, a sandstorm had risen without warning. Traders who saw it from the edge of the dunes swore that it wasn't red like normal storms, but faintly silver under the moonlight, as if lit from within. Some said it moved too slowly, dragging across the desert like a tide returning home. The next morning, the storm had vanished. The sky was cloudless and the sand gleamed smooth and untouched. But near the researchers' camp, a new dune had formed overnight, tall, perfect, symmetrical. It wasn't on their maps. Elias walked around it, puzzled. Then he saw something at its base. A sliver of dark stone poking out of the sand, carved with a familiar symbol. A circle, a triangle, and a line. The same as the museum relic. He brushed the surface gently. The stone was warm to the touch, as if it had been waiting. His team unearthed more of it, revealing part of a wall. Polished, precise, unnaturally preserved. The more they uncovered, the clearer the carvings became. Scenes of towers, caravans, and a figure standing before them all, holding a small bowl. Elias felt a shiver trace his spine. "The keeper," he whispered. That night, he sat outside the camp long after the others slept. The wind was faint, brushing soft against the tent walls. Somewhere in the darkness, something flickered, a faint glow like firelight far away. He thought it was a reflection at first, maybe from a metallic instrument, but then the light began to move, slow and deliberate, weaving between the dunes. He stood, heart steady but curious. The glow grew brighter, not harsh but golden, pulsing softly, and with it came a scent, resin, sweet and smoky, ancient as prayer. Elias closed his eyes. "Nabir," he said quietly. When he opened them again, the glow was gone. Only the stars remained, fierce and cold. He didn't tell the team what he saw, but he began to keep a journal, not of data, but of impressions. How the sand seemed to hum when he spoke aloud. How the instruments went silent when he played back recordings of wind. How some nights he dreamed of a man walking beside him, neither young nor old, always silent. Weeks later, when the expedition ended, Elias left a small offering at the base of the new dune. A modern glass vial filled with resin, sealed tight, mirroring the one from 1,000 years before. He didn't light it. He simply pressed it into the sand and whispered, for memory, when the wind rose. He thought he heard something whisper back, not in words, but in rhythm, like the slow echo of 30,000 hearts. Half a century after Elias Karam's expedition, the desert once again became a place of pilgrimage. But these pilgrims did not come to worship, they came to remember. By then, humanity had spread itself far and wide, across the edges of space, to domed cities on the moon, to glass towers that reached the upper clouds. Yet despite every conquest, there remained one truth. The past still called to them. And nowhere called louder than the empty quarter, where 30,000 souls had vanished, and the sand still breathed their names. Each year, hundreds of travelers arrived at the edge of that ancient sea of dunes. Some were scholars, some artists, others wanderers who had read too many myths. They brought with them little, a tent, water, and something to burn. At dusk they would light their offerings, tiny sticks of resin, modern incense, small fires that flickered and went out quickly. From above, the satellites recorded a breathtaking sight. Dozens of faint lights scattered across the dunes like a constellation fallen to earth. Among those travelers was Samir Khatan, a middle-aged historian who had spent his youth writing about forgotten civilizations. He had dismissed the Ubar legend as a romantic fabrication. But then, one night while restoring a damaged archive, he found Elias Karam's final journal, pages blurred by heat and age. The last line caught him like a hook. The desert remembers us when we remember it. Samir could not let that sentence go. 2 months later, he was standing in the same sands that had once buried Ubar. He came alone. His camp was simple, a single tent and a lantern. During the day, he wandered aimlessly, tracing the soft rises where he imagined streets might have been. At night, he listened. The desert had its own language, the shifting hiss of sand, the occasional deep sigh of cooling air, the faint vibration that could have been imagination or something older. On his 4th night, Samir dreamt vividly. He was walking through a city of white stone. The towers shimmered like heat itself. People moved around him, their faces indistinct, voices layered upon one another like overlapping waves. At the end of a long street stood a man holding a bowl of smoke, its tendrils climbing toward a sky that was both day and night at once. Samir called out, but no sound came. The man turned, eyes ancient and gentle. Then everything collapsed into light. He woke gasping, sand clinging to his skin. His lantern had gone out. Outside the tent, the air was unnaturally still. And then faintly, a scent touched him, sweet and smoky, unmistakable. He didn't light a new fire. He simply sat in silence, realizing that the story had never been about finding the lost city. It was about being found by it. In the morning, when he broke camp, he left behind his notebook. Inside, he wrote one line. For those who listen long enough, the desert speaks. He did not look back as he walked away. But a passing satellite image, taken years later, would show something peculiar. Near the coordinates where Samir camped, the sand formed a perfect ring, as though pressed gently by unseen hands. The pattern was visible only for a few weeks before the wind erased it. And so the cycle continued. Each century, another person came, drawn by something they couldn't name, seeking a city that may never have existed, finding instead a quiet truth, that memory is not buried, only patient. Sometimes at night, Travelers say they see faint lights moving across the dunes, not torches, not machines, but soft golden glows drifting in silence. They call them the lamps of Ubar. Others say those are the spirits of the vanished 30,000, still walking the streets of a city only the desert can see. But the oldest guides will shake their heads, smile, and correct them softly. No, that's just Nabir, still lighting incense so the world doesn't forget, and when the wind moves just right, carrying that subtle sweetness through the night. Even the skeptics fall silent, because sometimes silence feels like proof. By the time humankind began to travel between planets as easily as their ancestors once crossed seas, the story of Ubar had become a fable told in classrooms and aboard starships. Yet every generation produced one listener who could not accept that it was only a story. Among them was Lina Al-Masri, a cartographer for the Interplanetary Heritage Council. Her task was to map forgotten sites on Earth before climate and neglect erased them completely. She had studied data feeds from hundreds of ruins, but one patch of the Arabian desert always refused to stay still. The dunes there seemed to move in patterns no algorithm could predict, like something beneath them was breathing in its sleep. When the council lost interest, Lina booked a solo descent. The desert had grown harsher in the warming centuries, dunes of glassy sand, air trembling with heat. She landed her skimmer near the coordinates once marked by Elias Karam and stepped onto ground that shimmered as if made of light. For hours she walked with scanners and recorders, finding nothing but silence and wind. At sunset she stood on a ridge and watched the shadows lengthen. The stillness was absolute. Then her sensors began to hum softly. Lines of faint magnetism appeared in the data, circles and corridors traced beneath the surface. A city's bones. She knelt, brushed her glove across the sand, and felt warmth pulse faintly through it. "Hello," she whispered, unsure to whom. That night she camped under a sky thick with stars. Her fire burned clear blue from the mineral dust in the air. She thought of the man from legend, the one who had watched his city vanish and never stopped walking. "If you're still here," she said to the dark, "I'm listening." A breeze answered, carrying with it a smell impossible for that world, resin and smoke, the scent of frankincense. It lasted only a heartbeat. Then the air grew still again, as if the desert had acknowledged her and returned to rest. In the morning, Lina recorded her findings in a quiet voice. Coordinates verified. Subsurface pattern consistent with pre-collapse architecture. But data fluctuates. Structures seem to appear and dissolve. Perhaps not ruins at all. Perhaps memory. She transmitted the files to orbit and prepared to leave. Before boarding, she placed a small metal capsule in the sand, half scientific beacon, half offering. "For Nabir," she murmured, when her ship rose into the bright air. Cameras captured something the sensors could not explain. A spiral of golden dust unfurling from the ground, rising straight into the atmosphere. It twined upward until it vanished among the clouds. Weeks later, the transmission reached the outer colonies. People replayed the footage endlessly. Commentators argued over what the spiral was: thermal vent, magnetic anomaly, illusion. But for millions watching on their screens, the meaning was simpler. It was proof that the story was still alive. Pilgrims began to return, not only to the desert, but to any place where something precious had been lost. Abandoned cities, drowned coasts, forgotten temples. They came to light small fires, whisper names, and remember that nothing truly disappears if someone is still willing to listen. And in the oldest desert of all, where the sand never rests, there remains a single faint vibration deep below the surface, a heartbeat slower than time, steady as breath. Sometimes, when storms pass and the sky is clear, it sends up a thin thread of smoke, perfectly straight, as if to remind the world, the city was never gone. It only learned to speak through silence, and somewhere in that silence, Nabir still walks, light in hand, eyes turned toward the horizon. keeping watch over the 30,000 souls and all those who have come after, still burning incense against the forgetting. Centuries slid by like wind over dunes. The earth itself aged into myth. Its cities emptied, its oceans shifted, humanity scattered among stars, carrying fragments of memory, the smell of rain, the sound of waves, and the stories that had survived the longest journey of all. Ubar was one of those stories. It appeared in lullabies sung aboard colony ships, in murals on glass domes, in the names of research vessels. But even as the tale spread across galaxies, few believed there was ever truly a city beneath the sand. They thought of it as a symbol, a reminder of how pride could fall, or how devotion could outlast time. Then came Mira, a linguist from the frontier world of Asterion, where nights were long and silence stretched like a sea. She specialized in ancient tongues, the languages that no one spoke anymore except in dreams. One evening, while studying old Earth transmissions, she found a set of audio recordings labeled Ubar Field Resonances, 2093. At first, it was just low static, the faint hum of shifting particles. But when she slowed it down, way down, it became something else. A pattern, a rhythm that almost resembled breath. Then faintly, under the hum, a pulse like a word forming through sand. She cleaned the signal, amplifying the smallest vibrations. The sound that emerged was not quite voice, not quite wind, but it carried shape and tone. It rose and fell as if reciting something from memory. She translated the waveform into text patterns, and what appeared made her tremble. We are not gone. We are the breath between dunes. We are what the desert kept. No algorithm could have invented it. The resonance was too human, too deliberate. Mira didn't sleep that night. She spent hours running the recording through simulations, verifying data, eliminating interference. Everything pointed to the same impossible conclusion. The sound came from beneath the surface of the empty quarter, still active after half a millennium. She decided to go. Traveling to Earth took weeks. From orbit, the planet looked half wild again, its deserts glowing amber under the thin atmosphere. She landed where Lena Al-Masri's beacon once stood, long buried by sand. Her suit filtered the heat, but she could still feel the weight of the sun pressing down. She unpacked her instruments and began to record. The air was utterly silent, not a single bird, no wind. Then, slowly, a faint vibration touched her boots. Steady, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of something enormous and patient. Mira closed her eyes. I hear you, she whispered. The sand answered. Not with words this time, but with motion. The ground beneath her shifted gently, forming small ripples that expanded outward in perfect circles. In the center of those ripples, the sand rose and fell like breath, and for an instant, only that, she saw shapes within the haze. A man with a bowl of smoke, a city gleaming like morning. 30,000 figures turned toward the light. Then the vision dissolved, leaving only wind and the soft scent of incense that had not been burned in 1,000 years. She left her recorders running, capturing the hum, the rhythm, the silence itself. Before departing, she wrote in her log, "The city is not lost. It listens, and sometimes when we remember, it answers." When Mira's ship rose from the desert, its engines scattered a spiral of dust that lingered long after she was gone. From orbit, it looked like a single symbol drawn upon the surface: circle, triangle, line, the same mark carved on the stones of Ubar, the same that Nabir once traced into sand before the city vanished. And far below, deep under dunes older than any map, something breathed once, slow, vast, and peaceful. The breath of a city that had waited an eternity to be heard. The desert had kept its promise. It had swallowed Ubar. Yes, but it had never let it die. Generations passed after Mira's discovery. The recording she made of the desert's hum traveled farther than any explorer ever could. They became a shared ritual among the scattered worlds. When new settlements were founded, the colonists would play the sound of Ubar's breath before they built their first homes. It was a reminder that even the greatest cities begin in silence, and that silence itself is not emptiness, but waiting. Scholars studied the signal, arguing endlessly about whether it was geological resonance or some unknown natural phenomenon. Artists turned it into music. Poets called it the lullaby of the earth. And every few years a traveler would return to the empty quarter, bringing a vial of resin or a handful of soil, leaving it where the dunes hummed the loudest. The offerings were never found again, but each one seemed to make the air tremble a little longer. No monuments were built over the ruins. No museums claimed the name Ubar. The desert remained untouched, as if it had finally been granted the respect it had asked for. Still, sometimes at twilight, satellites would catch a flicker of light moving across the dunes. The pattern was always the same, a line of faint golden sparks, drifting east to west, pausing once at the ridge where the city's gate had once stood. Scientists dismissed them as electrical discharges from the heated sand. But those who knew the story whispered differently. They said Nabir still walked, not bound by time, not by grief, but by memory. That he walked so the world would never forget the 30,000 who vanished. That he carried a single flame through eternity, small enough to fit in his hand, bright enough to be seen from the stars. On Asterion, where Mira spent her last years, she kept a small bowl carved from translucent stone on her desk. Inside it, a pinch of sand. When she died, her students found a note tucked beneath the bowl. It read simply, "The desert never took them. It taught them how to stay." Afterward, her students released her ashes into Asterion's wind, whispering her words into the night. The recordings of Ubar played quietly through their transmitters, the hum carrying across the thin air. In that moment, far away on the long-forgotten earth, the empty quarter stirred once more. A soft pulse rippled through the dunes. For a heartbeat, a single strand of golden smoke rose from the sand and curled upward, straight, unwavering, until it vanished into the starlight. Then the desert was still again, silent, endless, listening, and if someone had stood there then, just for an instant, they might have heard a voice beneath the wind, calm and certain, saying the words Nabir had carried since the beginning. "We are remembered."